Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Sharps for the World of the Mind. We've been talking about the nature of eyewitness memory, which is a major subject of my recent book, The Forensic View: Investigative Psychology, Law Enforcement, Space Aliens, Exploration, and the Nature of Madness. Now, as I mentioned in a previous audio recording here, why do we have all those topics? Because there is continuity in the nervous system, and an awful lot of what we see in investigative psychology and law enforcement with reference to eyewitness memory operates in many other venues as well. People who think they've seen the space aliens, or for that matter, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, etc., they are eyewitnesses to these things. People who are great explorers of the world. The first time somebody from a different culture has seen such and such an animal or such and such a place, they're eyewitnesses. Psychologists and psychiatrists, when we see the symptoms manifesting of different mental conditions, we are eyewitnesses to those. So eyewitness dynamics, eyewitness thinking and memory go through many different walks of life. That's what all of that is doing in my book, The Forensic View. But let's focus a little bit more on investigative psychology and law enforcement. Eyewitness memory. Now, in our previous presentation here, we talked a bit about the fact that eyewitness memory is not static. It's not eternal and unchanging. We've known this since the work of a psychologist named Bartlett in the 1930s, that memory changes in three directions. The direction of gist, the core is preserved, brevity, as details are lost, and even personal belief, what we believe we've seen or even going to see, changes the nature of that memory. But that's true even in the experimental laboratory, where people are sitting there in front of screens in perfectly comfortable chairs. They could be eating popcorn when they're in these experiments. What happens out in the real world? Think about a witness to a violent crime that's in fear of their own life, okay? Fear for their life. Think about an officer-involved shooting where the officer has this terrible decision to make. And that officer, if that officer fires, whether the shoot was justified or not, that officer is going to be in a lot of trouble for a very, very long time, okay? What are they basing the necessity to shoot on? On their eyewitness memory of something they saw, perhaps an armed suspect, do perhaps a fraction of a second ago. That's eyewitness memory. In work I've conducted, which we'll talk about in a later presentation, we even find this in the detection of bombs, of terrorist devices, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, in the world of EOD, explosives ordnance disposal. Sometimes explosive devices are disguised, sometimes they aren't, but whether or not you recognize it as such depends on your eyewitness memory of that device, even a few seconds ago. So all these phenomena, really, all these processes are subject to stress, to the nature of what's happening in the mind. Now, there are a variety of factors we'll talk about as we go in this series, okay? For example, relative darkness. I don't know why anybody needs an expert witness to explain this, as I have many times, but people really can't see in the dark, okay? The other thing is people explaining something that they saw on the other side of a brick wall. You can't really see through stuff you can't see through, okay? But we get rid of factors like that, these wonderful estimator variables we could talk about at a later time. Let's just look at the nature of stress. What does stress, physiological and psychological stress, the stress of effort, the stress of fear, the stress of pain, what does this do to our ability to remember? Well, when a human being, or for that matter, many other kinds of animals, go into a stressful response, their body changes, okay? Humans enter the fight or flight response. And as we do that, our breathing rate goes up, right, which gives us more oxygen to our body. And our heart rate goes up, which ships that oxygen and various food, bits and pieces of food, right, around inside our body more rapidly. So our blood pressure goes up because our heart rate is up, right? And you could blow a gasket, except you vasodilate many of the blood vessels in your body, right? They get larger to carry that huge blood flow. But suddenly all that blood's flowing around in there, and it's pretty amazing because it's going to your muscles. Suddenly your muscles have extra food energy, extra oxygen, and you're going to literally become a super person. Okay? You're going to be stronger, have better endurance. Other things the brain does we're not going to go into detail on, but it actually makes you feel painless. Okay? You're in great shape. But all that blood's got to come out of someplace. And where are going to take it out of? Well, interesting thing about the brain. It's an enormous energy hog. It weighs about 2% of your body weight. That's all it weighs, thereabouts, okay? But it'll use thereabouts of 20 odd percent of your blood-borne resources. The brain's an incredible energy hog. And when you start moving all that blood around in your body to deal with running and fighting and all this other stuff, it's not that available for your brain. The problem is there's lots of parts of your brain that you can't shortchange. Parts that are involved in breathing and heartbeat and things like that, you don't want to turn those down, okay? The parts that are involved in routing signals around inside the brain, you may need those going too, okay? And in the upper part of the brain, the cortex, that's the big gray wrinkly bit that everybody thinks about when they hear the word brain, okay? There's a lot of parts of the cortex you need to be functioning pretty well. The parts that control your motor movements, right? The movements of your body, the parts that tell you what things are and where things are, the part at the back, the occipital cortex that's involved in detecting visual stimuli at all. You do not want to suddenly lose your ability to see in the middle of a fight or the middle of running away from something, do you? Okay. And the parts that understand where your body is at any given time, what it's doing, the parietal lobe there's all these parts you just plain can't shortchange. But nobody has to do quadratic equations when they're fighting or running away. And so one part that we shortchange in terms of the resources, and by the way, the physiology of this is mind-bogglingly complex. I talk a little bit about it in my book, The Forensic View, the book we're talking about right now. But, excuse me, the fact of the matter is that you can shortchange the prefrontal cortex a bit. Now, the prefrontal cortex is where we do our judgment, our thinking, where we inhibit our impulses to do things that are a really bad idea, okay? Punching the wrong person, for example, okay? And when we're under any kind of stress, we reduce the resources to the prefrontal cortex, which means that no matter how smart you started out before you went under stress, you're not going to be as smart as you used to be. You may still be smarter than some other people, but you're not going to have the intelligence you do when you're calm. Now, one way of being highly aroused physiologically and psychologically, which takes some of that blood out of the prefrontal cortex, so to speak, okay, I'm going to get a little fast and loose with that. Let's say we're shortchanging the resources a bit, okay, is under sexual circumstances. Often when you're sexually aroused, you're not quite as bright as you might want to be, which is why so many people make so many terrible mistakes in back seats and hotel rooms the world over, okay? But another time you're stressed is when somebody's shooting, especially if they're shooting at you, or they might be shooting at you, or they're roaring down the road in a vehicle trying to, run somebody over, get away from something. All these things, right, where you've got high stress. People are shouting at each other in a bar. Suddenly the bar fight starts. You're not thinking as clearly as you might want to be. Now, under those circumstances, what happens to us? Our eyewitness memory is not so good. Now, if you've taken psychology class, you're going, wait just a minute here. The main place that memory is consolidated, the main place that goes from short-term to long-term memory, is in a structure that isn't even in the cortex. It's down there in a structure called the hippocampus. Now, that's true. But when we're processing our memories, we are thinking about them, and that happens in the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where we think about all the experiences that we've had. And that experience can get into our memories. And so what we tend to do is move from the direction of feature-intensive processing, where we notice all these fascinating features, all things that are going on, to a much more gestalt world. That word gestalt, it's a wonderful word. In psychology, we refer to things, gestalt analysis, I should say, is basically analyses of configurations or wholes, as in the whole thing, okay? If you're doing a gestalt analysis of a hit and run, let's say, okay? A feature-intensive analysis. You might remember the color of the car, the make of the car, something about the face of the driver, something about maybe the license plate. If you're lucky, you may have all that good stuff in your mind with a feature-intensive analysis. But we don't tend to do that when we're under stress. We tend toward gestalt analyses, which means we remember a really fast car that went splat. Not that useful, is it? I have seen in specific crime situations a witness who was under great stress at the time that at first they remembered a general type of gun, okay, which as the testimony continued turned into another type of gun entirely then in the mind into an ice pick, believe it or not, then into some kind of gun, but I'm not quite sure what kind, and then into, finally, the witness remembers a gun that bore no resemblance to anything they'd remembered before. And here's the point. That witness was not lying. But that witness didn't know much about guns. That witness didn't know much about weapons either. So when that witness thought, I am looking at such and such a gun, I'm reasonably sure of the details, what that witness was really remembering was some kinda gun, possibly spelled Kinda, okay? And then, remember the ice pick? Suddenly, she wasn't even remembering some kind of gun. It was some kind of weapon, or possibly a general concept of weaponitude or weaponicity, okay? And that was the evidence on which a homicide was being investigated. Under stress, we don't remember as well, and that's something we don't want to believe that. There's a human phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. We'll talk more about that in a later presentation. But cognitive dissonance basically means the more I've invested in something, okay, the better I like it, okay? You've probably seen this in people you know. They've come out of a horrible marriage, a horrible relationship, and they go completely to pieces, okay? And sometimes people will try to patch together a horrible relationship, and you know what? They're more likely to do it if they've been in it for a long time. They've invested a lot in the relationship. Even though it's horrible, they still place a high value on it. They're not thinking in what we refer to as feature-intensive terms. Well, suppose you've got your story wrong because you were so highly aroused that all you remembered was, I think it was a real big guy, or I think it was a fast car that went splat. That's all you really remember? And now people start challenging you? You've got an investment in your story, don't you? So by the time you're there in court, you may be amazingly invested in your story. Now, I mentioned this in an earlier presentation. One of the most compelling things to any jury is a witness, an eyewitness, who is credible, confident, and attractive. Okay, once again, if you're going to be accused of a crime, make damn sure you're accused by ugly people, okay? And guess what? You can't really assure that, can you? But people look so credible, they look so confident when they really believe what they're saying. And once you've told the same story a dozen times, you may be very invested. You may be very apparently credible, and you may be amazingly confident. So these are some of the ways in which simple arousal, physiological and psychological arousal, will change the nature of eyewitness memory. But there are many other factors as well. Factors that have to do with things like light, like what was between you and what you were looking at, okay? Like how long did you have a chance to see whatever it was? We're talking about some of these factors as we go on in this series. I'm Dr. Matthew Sharps. This is The World of the Mind. I'm talking about my book, Forensic View, The Forensic View, and we hope you'll subscribe if you feel like it. Thank you very much.